He once quit a job he'd wanted for years, on the spot, over a disagreement so minor most people wouldn't remember it a week later. Not because he didn't want the job, because some part of George Costanza had already decided, long before he walked into that office, that he wasn't going to be allowed to keep it anyway. George Costanza never needed bad luck. He needed permission to prove himself right. Welcome back to the Character Couch. I've rewatched this show enough times to predict George's disasters before they happen, and for years I laughed at him the same way everyone does, the neurotic, bald, unlucky friend who can't catch a break. But you don't just see a man with terrible luck. You see someone actively, unconsciously arranging his own failures, over and over, because failure was always safer than finding out what happens if he actually tries, and it isn't enough. By the end of this video, every disaster George Costanza has ever caused himself is going to look a lot less like bad luck, and a lot more like a plan. There's a term for what George does, and it isn't simple bad luck. Psychologists call it self-sabotage, a pattern where a person unconsciously undermines their own success, because failure, however painful, feels more predictable and more survivable than the anxiety of genuinely trying and still coming up short. If you engineer your own disaster, at least you control the ending. George doesn't fail by accident. He fails on schedule almost every time, because failure was always the version of the story he trusted most. George's father, Frank, is loud, volatile, and prone to eruptions over the smallest provocations, the kind of household where emotional temperature could shift from calm to chaos in a single sentence. Frank's outbursts aren't really about whatever specific thing triggered them. They're about a man who never learned to modulate his own anxiety and simply let it detonate outward instead. Growing up in that environment taught George something specific and lasting. Conflict is inevitable, explosive, and largely outside anyone's control. If chaos is coming no matter what you do, the only rational response is to stop investing in outcomes that chaos will probably ruin anyway. Bracing for disaster isn't pessimism in that house. It's just accurate forecasting, learned early and reinforced constantly. That lesson didn't stay in his childhood home. It followed George into every job interview, every relationship, and every moment where trying fully was actually an option. If Frank taught George that disaster was inevitable, his mother Estelle taught him that he was usually the cause of it. Estelle's parenting runs on a steady undercurrent of guilt and disappointment, quick to critique, slow to reassure, treating George's failures less like bad luck and more like confirmation of something she already suspected about him. That combination is corrosive in a very specific way. A child who believes disaster is coming might still hope to avoid it. A child who's also told, repeatedly, that he's the reason disaster keeps arriving stops trying to avoid it altogether and starts treating failure as simply who he is. George doesn't sabotage himself because he wants to fail. He sabotages himself because succeeding would mean rewriting a story his own mother told him about himself before he ever had the chance to disprove it. That story became the quiet screenplay behind nearly every major decision he makes as an adult, starting with the identity he tries to build instead of the one he was handed. At one point, George invents an entire fake identity as an architect, a lie that spirals further than he ever intends, eventually requiring him to answer detailed questions about a profession he knows nothing about. Played as farce, it's one of the show's most purely comedic threads. Examined closely, it reveals something quietly desperate underneath the joke. George doesn't lie about being an architect because he's trying to impress a specific person in that moment. He's trying on an identity that comes with competence, respect, and stability built in, three things his real life has never reliably offered him. The lie isn't really about deception. It's a rough sketch of the man George might have wanted to become, tried on because building that person for real felt entirely out of reach. Of course, a lie that elaborate can't survive contact with reality for long, and its eventual collapse follows a pattern George would repeat almost everywhere else in his life. George's engagement to Susan Ross ends when she dies from licking the toxic glue on cheap wedding invitation envelopes, a detail George had insisted on to save money. His reaction to her death isn't grief. It's a private, unmistakable sense of relief, quickly suppressed but visible underneath the surface. That reaction is horrifying precisely because it's honest. George had spent the entire engagement quietly panicking about a life of genuine commitment, a life that would require him to actually show up as a real partner rather than simply avoid disaster one crisis at a time. Susan's death solves the problem the only way George's psychology knew how to process and escape, not by confronting the fear directly, but by having the decision removed from his hands entirely by something horrific and external. It's the darkest possible illustration of his pattern. When trying feels unsurvivable, some part of George would rather have the choice taken away completely than face what failing at it, on his own, might actually mean about him. In one of the show's most famous storylines, George and his friends make a bet over who can go the longest without masturbating, a plot that's almost entirely comedic on its surface, but it also captures something specific about George. His relationship to self-control is less about discipline and more about proving, competitively, that he isn't as weak as he privately suspects he is. George needs to win that bet in a way that goes beyond simple pride. Losing would confirm, in front of the people whose opinion matters most to him, exactly the kind of lack of control he already fears defines him. The stakes are absurd. The anxiety underneath them isn't. It's a small, silly storyline that nonetheless reveals George's core operating fear in miniature, that if people really watched closely enough, they'd see exactly how little control he actually has over anything. George's job as assistant to the traveling secretary for the New York Yankees is notably one of the only positions in the entire series where he experiences something resembling real competence and stability, ironically obtained mostly through an accidental lie and Kramer's chaotic intervention rather than his own effort. For a while, George is good at this job. He makes genuinely reasonable suggestions. He's occasionally even praised. And true to form, instead of settling into that rare stability, George treats it with suspicion, half expecting the good fortune to collapse at any moment, because in his experience it usually does. He never learns to simply inhabit success without bracing for its end. That inability to trust good outcomes, even when they're actually happening, is the clearest evidence that George's sabotage isn't really about opportunity. It's about an internal alarm system that treats safety itself as the thing most likely to be lying to him. Amid all of George's chaos, his friendship with Jerry Seinfeld remains one of the few consistently stable relationships in his life, stretching back to childhood. Jerry rarely tries to fix George or lecture him about his patterns. He mostly just tolerates them with a kind of weary, long-running amusement that somehow never curdles into real rejection. That consistency matters enormously to someone whose entire worldview is built on the expectation that people eventually leave, or explode, or use his failures against him. Jerry doesn't do any of that, decade after decade, disaster after self-inflicted disaster. It's the one relationship in George's life that never confirms his oldest fear, even as George continues, almost compulsively, to test its limits. That test never quite succeeds in breaking things. And the reason why says something important about the specific cultural moment these two friends came up in together. To understand George fully, it helps to understand the specific economic climate he came of age in. New York, in the late 1980s and 1990s, was a city of intense professional anxiety, a competitive, image-conscious job market where careers could stall or collapse without warning, and where status often depended more on appearing successful than actually being secure. George's chaotic employment history, and his tendency to overstate qualifications or fabricate credentials, isn't purely a personal failing. It reflects a broader environment that rewarded confident performance over verifiable substance, at least in the short term, in a city that already prized the appearance of success over its quieter, more difficult reality. George's instinct to fake competence, rather than build it patiently, wasn't an aberration. It was, in a distorted way, a reasonable adaptation to the incentives actually on offer. That cultural backdrop didn't create George's fear of failure, but it gave him a plausible, socially acceptable way to keep dodging it instead of addressing it directly. There's a second layer of context worth examining. George's household, and the specific texture of guilt that runs through it, draws heavily on a Jewish-American family dynamic long explored in American comedy. High expectations delivered alongside constant criticism, love expressed through worry and disappointment, rather than straightforward praise. In that cultural framework, failure isn't just personally painful. It's practically a family tradition, something to be anticipated, catastrophized, and eventually absorbed as identity. George didn't invent his anxious relationship to success. He inherited a specific emotional inheritance, amplified by his particular parents, but recognizable to an entire cultural tradition his character was written to reflect. That inheritance explains why George's sabotage so often looks less like carelessness and more like ritual, a story he already knew the ending to, playing itself out exactly the way he'd been raised to expect it would. Kramer occupies an unusual role in George's life, a walking embodiment of chaos who somehow experiences almost none of George's anxiety about outcomes. Kramer schemes constantly, fails constantly, and moves on from each disaster with a lightness George has never once managed to access himself. George often resents this, even envies it, without quite naming what he's actually envying. It isn't Kramer's success he wants. Kramer barely succeeds at anything either. It's Kramer's apparent immunity to the fear of failure itself, an emotional freedom George has spent his entire life associating with danger rather than possibility. Watching Kramer fail cheerfully, over and over, without lasting damage, offers George a version of consequence-free chaos he can observe up close but never seems to fully believe applies to him. George's history with Elaine, including a brief relationship long before the show begins, gives their friendship a different texture than his bond with Jerry. Elaine sees through George's excuses faster than almost anyone else, calling out his self-sabotage directly, often with blunt, exasperated honesty the other characters rarely offer him. Rather than pushing George away, that directness becomes oddly stabilizing. Elaine doesn't flatter George's excuses, but she also doesn't abandon him for having them, offering a version of honesty without rejection that his own family never modeled for him. It's a small, under-examined relationship in the show's larger mythology, but it demonstrates something George rarely encounters elsewhere. That being seen clearly, flaws included, doesn't automatically end in the disaster he's always braced for. But here's the part that caught me completely off guard. Jerry Seinfeld, the one everyone frames as the stable, amused observer standing safely outside George's chaos, mostly along for the ride, he's also, and I cannot believe I'm saying this, someone who needs George's dysfunction almost as much as George needs Jerry's patience. Think about it. Jerry's entire comedic persona depends on having something to react to, someone whose disasters he can narrate, whose failures give his own carefully controlled life a sense of comparative order. George isn't just a friend Jerry tolerates. He's a stable source of chaos Jerry can observe from a safe distance, without ever risking any of his own carefully maintained detachment. So the friend everyone assumes is simply enduring George all these years has actually been quietly relying on him too, using George's disasters to avoid examining how much of his own life runs on that exact same fear of getting too close to anything that might actually hurt. What George deserved, back in that house with Frank's eruptions and Estelle's disappointment, was proof that trying and failing honestly wouldn't cost him everything, not a lie about being an architect, not a fake stability borrowed from a job he stumbled into by accident. What he actually received was a lifetime of confirmation that failure was coming regardless, so he might as well arrange it himself, on his own schedule, before it could catch him by surprise. He built an entire personality around losing on purpose, so the loss would never again feel like it was actually his fault. He built it so well, he rarely let himself notice how often it worked exactly as planned. And in the moments Elaine called him out directly, without walking away afterward, that was the boy from that chaotic house, finally, quietly, discovering that being fully seen didn't have to end in disaster after all. The failures were never about the failures. They never were. So was George Costanza simply unlucky, or was he his own worst enemy? Neither, honestly. George wasn't a man cursed with bad luck who happened to make poor choices, and he wasn't a self-destructive man who merely happened to seem unlucky. He was someone who turned his parents' chaos into a permanent expectation of failure, because failing on his own terms was always going to hurt less than trying honestly and losing anyway. Maybe that's truer of more of us than we'd like to admit. Sometimes the person who seems to sabotage everything isn't careless at all. He's just protecting himself from a version of failure he never learned how to survive. So here's what I want to know. If George had grown up believing trying honestly was actually safe, do you think he still becomes a man who sabotages himself before anyone else gets the chance? Or was that fear always going to find him, one way or another, in that house? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more of these deep dives into the characters you thought you already understood, hit subscribe. The couch is always open.